Everyone's celebrating that we're finally graduating from armour that was current in the 80s. And honestly, they should be. The M113 first rolled off the line in 1960. That's not a misprint. The aluminium-hulled workhorse that carried troops through the rice paddies of Vietnam, that bounced across the deserts of the First Gulf War, that became the quiet backbone of every Armored Brigade Combat Team in the infantry. It was still in active service in the 2000s. Crews were riding in vehicles older than their parents, in some cases older than their grandparents' first car. More than 80,000 M113s were built over its production life, served in over 50 countries. But here's what that longevity actually meant on the ground. The M113's aluminium 5083 alloy armour was designed to stop small arms fire and shell fragments. Those were threats appropriate to a 1960s battlefield, where the nuclear dimension was supposed to do the heavy lifting, and nobody expected an APC to survive much more than rifle rounds and mortar splinters. Against modern anti-tank guided missiles, against 14.5mm heavy machine gun rounds from weapons like the Russian KPV, against the improvised explosive devices that defined 20 years of counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, the M113 wasn't outdated. It was a coffin with tracks. And the army knew it. They'd known for decades. In Iraq, M113 variants operating near the front were so vulnerable that units resorted to improvised armour. Sandbags, scrap steel, whatever they could bolt or weld onto the hull to buy a few extra millimeters of protection the original designers never intended. Soldiers called some of these rigs hillbilly armour. That's what happens when institutional procurement fails the people doing the fighting. The vehicle that was supposed to keep them alive couldn't do its job against threats that had existed for 30 years. So yeah, the AMPV is good news. 5 variants on a modified Bradley chassis, replacing every M113 role the Armored Brigade Combat Team depends on. The M1283 General Purpose Vehicle, your utility workhorse, moving ammunition, equipment and personnel wherever the brigade needs them. The M1284 Medical Evacuation Vehicle, designed to get wounded soldiers from the point of injury to treatment under armour, with enough internal volume and medical mounting points that medics can actually work on a casualty during transport, instead of just holding pressure and hoping. The M1285 Medical Treatment Vehicle, and this distinction matters, isn't just an ambulance. It's a mobile treatment facility, carrying the equipment and workspace for physicians or physician assistants to perform emergency stabilization procedures that the cramped M113 ambulance variant simply couldn't accommodate. The M1286 Mission Command Vehicle, which provides mobile command post capability with the power generation, communications architecture and workspace that brigade and battalion commanders need to run a fight from inside armour, instead of parking a tent behind a berm. That variant alone accounts for the largest planned buy at 993 units. And the M1287 mortar carrier, fielding 120mm mortar capability from within the protected hull, rather than forcing crews to dismount and set up in the open. 386 of those planned. Total planned procurement, 2,897 vehicles across all 5 variants. First prototype rolled out in December 2016. By December 2022, BAE had delivered 200 low-rate initial production units. Production is climbing hard through fiscal years 2025 and 2026 as the Army pushes toward full rate and starts getting these things into the brigade combat teams that have been waiting for them. At 36 to 40 tons, depending on configuration, the AMPV is 3 times the weight of the M113 it replaces. That single number tells you how much more protection, power generation, and internal volume got packed into the hull. If you've seen the Kelsey Grammer movie, and I know this audience has, the AMPV is the anti-Pentagon Wars vehicle. It took a proven chassis, stayed in its lane, didn't try to become a tank or a drone carrier or whatever fever dream a requirements committee could conjure at 3 in the morning. For a defense bureaucracy notorious for bloated next-generation moonshots that die expensive deaths, that restraint is genuinely impressive. But a comment on the last video stopped me cold, and I haven't been able to shake it since. When a defense bureaucracy that normally chases perfect in 10 years suddenly pivots to good enough now, when the same system that burned $18 billion on future combat systems without fielding a single operational system suddenly decides pragmatism is the play, that's not just common sense. Historically, that's a signal, and the signal isn't comforting. Several of you earned this follow-up. The comments section on the first video surfaced information and analysis I either missed or didn't have. 3 separate people converged on the same structural concern without coordinating. An engineer's claim showed up that reframes how the entire survivability picture looks. So this is structured like a briefing. Here's what we know. Here's what we didn't have. Here's what complicates the picture. And then we zoom out to the part that might keep you up tonight. Let's start with the reward for clicking. According to an engineer who claimed involvement in the AMPV program, and this surfaced through defense community discussion, not an official BAE press release or Department of Defense test report, so calibrate your confidence accordingly. The AMPV hull reportedly survived a direct hit from a 155mm artillery shell during testing without suffering a hull breach. I want to treat this claim with the seriousness it deserves, which means treating it carefully. What was conveyed is that this was a direct hit, not a glancing strike, not a proximity detonation at standoff distance, but a direct hit from a 155mm shell. And the hull maintained structural integrity. It held. Even the conservative interpretation of that claim is remarkable. And here's why. A 155mm high-explosive artillery round weighs roughly 43 kilograms. It is the standard heavy artillery munition used by virtually every modern military on the planet, including Russia's, including China's. Its blast effects are engineered to destroy hardened positions and disable armored vehicles through a combination of fragmentation, overpressure, and raw kinetic violence. The fragmentation pattern alone can shred light armor at dozens of meters from the point of detonation. Most infantry fighting vehicles in the global inventory would suffer catastrophic structural failure from a direct 155mm impact. The BMP family, the Soviet-era vehicles that remain the most common IFVs on Earth, would be shredded. The M113 it replaces? Not even a conversation. The crew's dead. Even vehicles with significantly heavier armor profiles than a typical APC have serious concerns about 155mm at close range. Main battle tanks worry about 155mm hits on their thinner roof and top armor. And the AMPV, a support vehicle whose primary job isn't to fight, but to carry medics, commanders, and mortar teams, reportedly maintained hull integrity under a direct hit from that caliber. I want to be precise about what hull integrity means here and what it doesn't mean. A hull that holds isn't the same as a crew walking away untouched. Spall, fragments of interior hull material that break loose under impact and ricochet through the crew compartment at bullet velocities, kills even when armor isn't penetrated. The physics are vicious. The outer face of the armor absorbs the hit, but the shockwave propagates through the material, and the inner face ejects fragments inward at velocities sufficient to be lethal. Concussive effects from a 155mm class event can cause traumatic brain injuries, ruptured organs, shattered bones. Internal electronic systems get wrecked, sensors fail, radios die. A 155mm event is catastrophic for the vehicle, even when the hull stays intact. But hull integrity is the single most critical variable in whether anyone inside lives or dies. Once the hull is breached, once the armor fails and there's a hole, everything inside eats blast overpressure and white-hot fragmentation directly. Survival rates don't decline, they collapse. A hull that holds gives the crew a chance. A hull that doesn't gives them nothing. And a support vehicle hull, apparently capable of holding under these conditions, tells you something very specific about the threat environment the engineers were designing against. This isn't a peacetime protection level. This is a hull built for the expectation that artillery, not IEDs, not small arms, but massed indirect fire from a peer-level adversary will be a primary killer on the next battlefield. Which is exactly what Ukraine has been confirming for 3 years running. The survivability story goes deeper than the hull itself, and this is where the design philosophy reveals just how seriously BAE and the Army took the question of how crews actually die. The AMPV stores its fuel externally. Russian tanks with their ammunition carousels sitting directly beneath the crew. A penetrator hits the carousel, the propellant cooks off, and the entire turret launches skyward on a column of fire. Everyone inside is dead before the turret touches ground. The principle with internal fuel is identical. Penetration plus internal fuel equals catastrophic crew loss at rates dramatically higher than the penetration alone would produce. The AMPV's external fuel architecture means that even in a worst-case scenario where a projectile reaches the fuel tanks, the fire burns outside the crew space, not inside it. The armoured enclosures around the external tanks provide their own layer of ballistic protection against fragment strikes and small arms. But even if those enclosures are defeated, even if the fuel ignites, the fundamental architecture keeps the fire and the fuel source physically separated from the humans. The flames are on the wrong side of an armoured wall to reach the crew. Every veteran who has trained on crew evacuation procedures for a vehicle fire understands viscerally why this matters. Every medic who has treated burn casualties from armoured vehicle fires knows what internal fuel does to the human body inside a sealed metal box. BAE didn't stumble into this design. They talked to the people who pull crews out of burning vehicles, studied the after-action data from every conflict where M113s and Bradleys had taken hits, and engineered the problem away at the architecture level. Not with a band-aid, not with a fire suppression system that might activate in time, with physical separation that makes the problem structurally impossible. A hull that reportedly survived a direct 155mm hit. Fuel stored outside the crew compartment in armoured enclosures. This isn't a lightly armoured taxi. This is a vehicle designed by people who understand exactly how crews die in high-intensity conventional warfare, and made every structural decision to prevent it. Which brings us to the part several of you raised independently. When three people who clearly know what they're talking about converge on the same concern from different angles, apparently without reading each other's comments, that's not a coincidence. That's a signal that a real trade-off exists in this vehicle that deserves its own section. The AMPV uses a welded unibody hull construction. The armour isn't a series of bolt-on panels attached to an internal frame. It's a unified structure, welded and formed, so that the hull is simultaneously the vehicle's skeleton and its protection. No separate armour panels bolted to a chassis underneath. The hull is the chassis. This is how you get the kind of survivability we just discussed. A welded unibody has no panel joints that can be pried apart by blast loading. No bolt attachment points creating stress concentrators under shock. No seams where overpressure can find a weak spot and exploit it. Force distributes across the entire continuous structure, rather than concentrating at connection points where panels meet. When that 155mm round reportedly hit the hull directly and failed to breach it, the unibody construction was almost certainly a major reason why. A continuous welded shell under blast loading is fundamentally stronger than an assembly of bolted panels. Physics, not opinion. But here's the cost. When a welded unibody hull takes damage that deforms the armour, not a catastrophic breach, just a dent, a crack, a section of hull warped beyond structural tolerance, you can't fix that forward. There's no panel to unbolt and swap out. No armour tile to pull off and replace from a logistics truck parked behind the tree line. The repair requires cutting out the damaged section, welding in new material, heat-treating the welds to restore metallurgical properties, and conducting structural inspection to verify the hull is back within tolerance. That work demands depot-level tooling, certified welders, controlled environments, non-destructive evaluation equipment, and quality assurance processes that simply don't exist anywhere near a front line. They can't exist near a front line. You can't heat-treat armour welds while someone is shooting at you. The vehicle has to be evacuated from the battlefield, loaded onto a heavy equipment transport, moved to the rear, potentially hundreds of kilometres behind the line of contact, then processed through a maintenance facility equipped for structural armour repair. Depending on the severity of the damage and the backlog at the depot, this takes weeks. Sometimes months. A vehicle that took a hit at 0600 on a Monday might not return to its unit until the next quarter. Compare that to vehicles built around modular armour philosophy. The Striker uses bolt-on ceramic armour tiles that a forward maintenance team can swap in hours. Unbolt the damaged tile, pull it off. Bolt on a replacement from pre-positioned stock. Vehicles back in the fight before the next patrol cycle. The Leopard 2's turret uses modular armour packages specifically designed so damaged sections can be swapped without touching the base structure. You can even upgrade protection levels the same way, pulling one generation of armour module and bolting on the next. Several MRAP designs from the counterinsurgency era used add-on armour kits built explicitly for rapid field replacement because the operational tempo in Helmand and Anbar demanded it. A vehicle sitting in a maintenance bay for a week was a vehicle not protecting a patrol route, not covering a supply convoy, not doing its job. Every bolt hole in a modular armour system is a potential stress concentrator. Every seam where panels meet is a potential failure point under blast. Modular joints are inherently weaker than continuous material. That's the engineering trade. But the operational payoff is a damaged vehicle back in the fight in hours instead of weeks. The AMPV chose the other side. Maximum structural integrity, maximum protection, at the cost of field repairability. For a short, sharp engagement, unambiguously the right call. You want every vehicle to survive every hit it takes, and you can afford to send damaged ones to the rear because the fight ends before logistics becomes the bottleneck. But in sustained, high-intensity conventional combat, the kind where armored brigades take dozens of vehicle hits per day across a wide front, where formations are in continuous contact for weeks or months, where you need to repair and return vehicles to the line faster than attrition eats your combat power because production can't keep pace with losses, the welded unibody creates a compounding logistics problem. Every hit that'd be a field repairable event on a Striker becomes a depot-level evacuation on an AMPV. Multiply that across a brigade combat team in sustained contact, then across multiple brigades operating simultaneously. The vehicle fleet doesn't just shrink from kills, it shrinks from repairable damage that can't be repaired fast enough. That math gets uncomfortable quickly. This is not a fatal flaw. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The engineers made a defensible choice, arguably the right choice, that prioritized the thing that matters most at the moment of contact: keeping people alive. The survivability data we just walked through is the direct result. But it is an honest trade-off. Harder to kill, harder to fix. In a perfect world, you get both. In the real world, you pick. The AMPV picked survival. Whether the Army's sustainment infrastructure is prepared for what that means at scale, across a full theatre with sustained attrition rates running for months, is a question still being worked. And the audience watching this channel is smart enough to deserve the complete picture, not just the highlights. Now, everything we've discussed so far lives in engineering analysis and test data. Important, but abstract. The AMPV's foundation has been validated somewhere far more brutal than any test range on Earth: Ukraine. The United States provided M2A20DS-SA Bradley infantry fighting vehicles as part of Western military aid packages beginning in early 2023. The 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade became the most prominent operator, throwing Bradleys into the teeth of the Zaporizhia counteroffensive starting in June 2023. The conditions were as close to a nightmare scenario for armored vehicles as modern warfare can produce. Dense, layered minefields, not scattered mines, but industrial-scale belts hundreds of meters deep. Pre-registered artillery kill zones, where Russian batteries had the coordinates memorized and could drop steel on any grid square within minutes. Russian attack helicopters armed with anti-tank missiles hunting from standoff range. Layered ATGM positions using Cornet and Conquer systems with overlapping fields of fire. Survive one missile and another's already in the air from a different angle. Vehicles were dying across that front at rates not seen since the Second World War. And the Bradley kept bringing its crews home alive. Video after video emerged from that summer and fall. Bradleys absorbing hits that would have been instantly fatal in a Soviet-era BMP. One of the most widely circulated clips showed a Bradley taking multiple impacts from Russian fire, including what appeared to be ATGM strikes, and the crew survived, evacuated, and lived to fight again. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar publicly noted that crews were surviving in Bradleys under conditions that would have killed them in the lighter Soviet-designed vehicles making up the bulk of Ukraine's fleet. The contrast with BMP-1s and BMP-2s was brutal. A single ATGM hit on a Soviet-era IFV frequently killed everyone inside. Thin armor, internal ammunition storage, everything conspired to turn a hit into a catastrophic kill. The same hit on a Bradley frequently destroyed the vehicle, but left the crew breathing. Injured, sometimes badly, but alive. Evacuatable, treatable, returnable to duty. In a war of attrition, and that is exactly what Ukraine's eastern and southern fronts have become, trained crews matter more than individual platforms. This point gets lost in the footage of burning vehicles, but it's the most important arithmetic of the entire war. You can build a new Bradley in a factory in months. You cannot replace a trained crew in months. The institutional knowledge, the muscle memory under fire, the unit cohesion built through shared contact, that's irreplaceable on any timeline that matters to the current fight. And the Bradley chassis was preserving exactly that asset. Here's why this connects directly to the AMPV. The AMPV doesn't just share some components with the Bradley, the way a sedan might share an engine with a truck. It shares the hull architecture, the protection philosophy, the structural DNA, the fundamental design that Ukrainian crews were betting their lives on in Zaporizhia is the same design lineage that BAE evolved into the AMPV. The lessons from Ukraine weren't theoretical inputs into a future design study. They were real-time combat validation of a chassis that was already in production for the AMPV program. And the Army saw those lessons arriving during the exact period that production was ramping toward full-rate decisions. Every defense attaché with access to the classified Ukrainian after-action data, every program manager watching the open-source footage, they were all seeing the same thing. The Bradley hull saves lives under conditions that match the threat scenarios the AMPV was designed for. That timing isn't coincidental. When a vehicle program accelerates in parallel with a major conventional war that's validating its core design choices in real time, the people making the production decisions aren't ignoring the data stream from the battlefield. They're incorporating it into every schedule milestone and every funding request. The M113 was overdue for replacement on the technical merits alone. Every vulnerability assessment and after-action review from 2 decades of counterinsurgency said so. Ukraine made the replacement urgent on a different level entirely. Ukraine showed the entire world what happens when inadequately protected vehicles meet modern conventional lethality at scale. And the Army responded by pushing harder on the program that already had the answer built and waiting on the production line. So here's where we zoom out. The AMPV isn't revolutionary. It doesn't field a directed energy weapon, no artificial intelligence, no optionally manned mode, no exotic propulsion or quantum sensors. It's a sensible, pragmatic, built on what works platform that takes proven components from an existing combat vehicle, wraps them in better armor with smarter survivability engineering, and gets them to the brigades on a timeline measured in years instead of decades. Meanwhile, the XM30, the next-generation replacement for the Bradley itself, carries an estimated unit cost several multiples higher, with a development timeline stretching deep into the 2030s before any soldier sees one in a motor pool. The AMPV is what you build when you're not sure you have time to wait for the XM30. Let that sentence sit for a second. Militaries behave differently when they believe conflict is close than when they believe peace will hold. This pattern is old. It's consistent across eras and nations and doctrines. And it's readable if you know what to look for. In peacetime, procurement is a laboratory for ambition. Programs get loaded with requirements from every stakeholder who can elbow their way to the table. Timelines stretch because there's no penalty for delay. Nobody's dying while the PowerPoint slides get revised for the 14th time. Technology gets chased to the bleeding edge because the assumption is that the next war sits far enough in the future to afford waiting for perfection. This is how you get future combat systems. The Army's grand vision for a networked family of 14 manned and unmanned systems that was going to revolutionize ground warfare from the ground up. Sensor fusion, autonomous resupply, networked fires. It was going to change everything. FCS consumed $18 billion over more than a decade before being cancelled in 2009 without fielding a single operational system to a single operational unit. The Crusader self-propelled howitzer followed the same arc. Too heavy, too expensive, too slow to develop, cancelled in 2002. The RAH-666 Comanche reconnaissance helicopter, nearly $8 billion across 22 years of development. Cancelled in 2004, having produced only 2 flyable prototypes. These were peacetime programs. Technologically breathtaking on paper, strategically ambitious in the briefings, and completely disconnected from the reality that soldiers needed better equipment now, not a concept video about 2035. But when militaries believe the clock is actually ticking, the behavior flips. Watch for it. Requirements get stripped to essentials. Proven technology gets prioritized over developmental risk. Production timelines compress violently. Programs that work get funded at scale, and programs that might work in a decade get shelved. The Sherman tank. Not the best tank of World War II by any individual metric. Not the best armoured, not the best gunned, not the fastest, but buildable, reliable, maintainable by conscript mechanics in a field depot using standardized parts. America didn't wait for the perfect heavy tank. It built 49,234 Shermans, because good enough right now, in sufficient quantity, wins wars that perfect in 3 years loses. Israel after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. A military that came within days of national annihilation, pivoting overnight from long-range research programs to immediate pragmatic procurement of whatever could get to the front and keep soldiers alive. The Merkava tank program was born from that trauma. Engine placed at the front as additional crew protection, rear door for emergency evacuation. Not because it was elegant engineering, because their crews had died in their tanks, and the country decided at every level that would never happen again if engineering could prevent it. The pattern holds, across eras, across nations. When procurement gets practical, when good enough now beats perfect in 10 years, that's not budgetary enlightenment. That's not some procurement reform success story. That is a military that believes it's going to need the equipment. Soon. Now look at the current landscape through that lens. Admiral Philip Davidson told Congress the threat window for a Taiwan contingency could arrive by 2027. The Davidson window, as strategists now call it. Ammunition production lines across the United States are expanding for the first time in decades. 155mm shell production alone is scaling from roughly 14,000 rounds per month toward a target of 100,000. The Replicator initiative is pushing autonomous systems toward the Pacific on emergency timelines that bypass normal acquisition processes entirely. Force posture across the Indo-Pacific is shifting. These aren't moves you make if you think peace holds indefinitely. These are moves you make if you think something is coming and you're running out of runway. And right in the middle of all that acceleration, the same army that spent $18 billion on a networked fantasy that never left PowerPoint looked at the AMPV and said, proven chassis, better armour, 5 variants, fuel outside the hull, get it to the brigades now. No moonshot, no revolution in military affairs, just protection that works, built on a platform Ukrainian soldiers validated with their lives in Zaporizhia. Push to the force on a timeline that suggests someone with stars on their shoulders doesn't believe we have the luxury of waiting for perfect. The AMPV might be the smartest thing the Army's done in decades. I really hope that's all it is. If this changed how you think about defence procurement, subscribe. More like this is coming.